Welcome to the Write Good Books podcast, the audio companion to WriteGoodBooks.com, with your host Jason Bougger.
Okay, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Jason, and we're once again joined by our co-host Scott Michael Childers.
Hello.
Hello. Are you good?
I am fabulous today.
Awesome, me too. It's a nice day. We got an AC running, so if you hear some background noise, that's it.
Either that or it's my brain leaking. One of the two.
It's either that and no AC. You'll have to listen to us pant, so I'd rather have a little bit of AC in the background. This week, we're going to try something a little bit different, a little more philosophical, if you will. We're going to look at the intent of the author versus the reader's interpretation of the author's work. And since this was a product of Scott's brain, we'll hand it over to Scott and make you do the hard part.
Oh, thanks.
So what do you think?
All right. Well, to kind of bring this topic into an introduction, first of all, I don't think we can cover it adequately in one 15 to 20 minute podcast. We're just going to give you kind of a overview of this whole debate between the author's intent in a work and the reader's interpretation of that work. As we've said, this is more philosophical, but you may, in your writing career, hit this type of situation. If you gain some success or notoriety, you may be involved in a book talk or a panel or something, and someone will ask you, what was your intent in writing this work? What was your deep meaning behind the work? And that would be the intent of the author. It's quite obvious, I think, after we've spelled it out like that. And then there is how your readers take that work and make it their own. They're reading it through the lenses of their experiences, their biases, their points of view. So how they interpret things, that would be the reader's reaction or interpretation of the work. And just like other forms of art, music, classical art and sculpture, you're going to get varying answers if you ask, what does this mean, from the author and the people who look at it. So, you have anything to add at this point?
You know, this is one of the things that made it hard to read books in high school English classes, because that was always the question you were asked. What message was the writer trying to convey? And I always felt like that was an unfair question because we don't always know. And you'll probably see that with your own work sometimes. Like you were saying, people are going to ask, what did you mean by this? And I'll be honest, most of the things I write, I don't have a message.
Yeah.
I just wanted to write a fun story.
Yeah. Well, and famous authors have had this too. I mean, my favorite example is The Wizard of Oz book by L. Frank Baum. For many years, I think starting in the 60s, people went back to that story and said, well, it's an allegory of the U.S. government going away from a gold standard, and the straw man symbolized the farmers, and the tin man represented the industry out of the Great Lakes area. And where they pulled this from, I'm not sure if it was actually intended to be that way. From what I know, it was just a children's story that he made up to entertain nephews and nieces and all that. So who's right? And that's a big question.
That's a great question.
And that discussion is what led me for us to talk about it. There are schools of thought that say the author is always right. The intent is always the author, and the reader has to try to figure that out. There are some that say the reader is always correct, no matter what the author may or may not have intended.
I would say it depends.
I would be in the same school too. It's like the author has a story they're trying to tell.
Yeah.
And they're telling it through their biases, their lenses, their ability to craft the words in a reasonable fashion.
Yeah. You know, Ayn Rand had a point of view she was trying to put through her novels. Mm-hmm. George Orwell had a point of view he was trying to put through his novels.
Yeah. And
I wouldn't say Stephen King does.
Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't know that until someone has actually put forward this is what I meant. Mm-hmm. Then there are people out there who say the author's intent is irrelevant. What the author meant to do doesn't matter because what the reader took out of it is the main thing. That's the end result. And there are a few people who believe this way. I think T.S. Eliot was one of those. Sometimes it's called new criticism. But then there's others, similar things. Like, I found this one thing for Marxist literary theories. And this is a quote from Wikipedia, so it may change by the time you listen to this. Marxist-derived theorists have seen authorial intent in a much more nuanced way. Basically says the author's intent is always a code for a particular set of ideologies. Always. And there's various others. If you spend some time digging around for authorial intent, you'll find all sorts of different types. I found 7 of them just in a few minutes of searching. But I think for us today, the rest of the time, I don't know if there's anything else I need to do to introduce this topic, or... Okay.
I think it's good.
Okay. So I think for the rest of the podcast, I think we'll talk about where we sit personally. For me, the idea, the meaning rests in the reader's eyes only, I don't agree with. Because every reader is different.
Yeah.
And it completely negates what the author's skill or biases, or where the author came from. I don't think that is appropriate, because the author had the story to tell. So I think it is a little bit of both. And people can take different meanings from the same thing. Like, 2 people watching a basketball game can see 2 different, very different games. Especially if they're home and visitor, right? One will see it's a great game because their team won. The other will say it's a bad game because their team lost. You know, there's a lot of that personal bias. So for me, the true meaning of a work lies somewhere as a combination of author and reader. Here's the thing, I'm biased. I'm an author. If I write something that doesn't have an expressed intentional allegory or deeper meaning, I don't want people to try to search and find one. Like, in my college years, I took a course, and if you did find some sort of sexual deep meaning in a work, well, you just weren't looking hard enough, because there was always sex. So, and like Jason was saying, his high school, there's always some meaning. Sometimes there isn't, at least not purposefully. So that's where I'm sitting. Jason?
I think every writer does have their own biases or their own opinions, and I think that'll show through in their work, but I don't think that necessarily means that they have a certain agenda or message they're trying to push. I think it might just be what comes in. It's like, I grew up in a small town full of Catholics, so when I write about a small town, if religion is mentioned, it happens to be small town Catholics. I'm not trying to push a Catholic agenda on anybody. Somebody might read that 100 years from now, which is, I think, what we all hope, that people are reading our work 100 years from now, saying, well, clearly this was a Catholic writer pushing a Catholic narrative, when that's not the case. So I guess that's where I could say, or I could see a misinterpretation of somebody's work. They might bring their own backgrounds in and make it look like they're favoring that over another point of view.
Mm-hmm.
I think I work in an academic setting. I've seen people theorize about works by, say, Willa Cather, saying she's conveying a message that I don't think she necessarily was. I won't really get into that, but you've seen it with Tolkien, you've seen it with everybody. So that's from the author point of view. I think it could be misinterpreted. From the reader point of view, I do take a message out of everything I read, just like I take a message out of every song I listen to, and it's usually a personal message that I almost assume the writer didn't put there on purpose. It's more like I just look how it relates to me, and then that makes me relate to it better. And I guess if anything, that's what I would like to see people do with my fiction. If you can touch them in some way so that they take it personally and enjoy it more.
Well, here's another thing. And I'm going to bring this into a really more, I don't want to say practical because it is still kind of theoretical, but I was reading recently, and the article came out a while ago, but I was reading it recently, that there are some people who took a look at a book by Rainbow Rowell called Eleanor and Park. I haven't read the book myself, so I don't have an opinion on the matter, but a lot of people were praising it because it had a character, Park, Korean background, right? And so he's dealing with all of those issues, being a Korean in America, mixed race, all of that stuff. And then there were other people who say no, as a racist. And the reason was because people had gone through those same things. They identified so closely with Park, but other parts of their lives weren't shown. Like, the struggles were there, but the good things that happened after weren't. And there's some other similar comments. So they're saying, okay, this is a negative stereotype of this type of life. It's a racist book. And I don't think Rainbow Rowell had ever any intention of writing a racist novel. I mean, and she's not, she doesn't have that background, and she's made other interviews. Like, it just seemed like this is the character, this is the story that to be told. And it is a story, and you couldn't live the whole life in what she was writing. Mm-hmm. But again, some people bringing in their own experiences, their own biases, had that message like this is an incomplete picture. And it's probably one of those, this is so good for this one part, but it's incomplete when it could be a much better book if it had that complete experience. I don't want to speak for those readers, because then I'm interpreting their responses, and they can speak to that themselves. So I would encourage you to go out and find, if you're interested in that controversy, and it's a mild one. Well, mild compared to some other controversies we've heard.
Sure.
Go out and see what people have said about that. And I think that's a recent example of author intent was write a good story about this type of relationship and these type of backgrounds. The reader taking something about, hey, this doesn't strike completely true. Now, for the genre writers, you might not have that experience much at all, where this is, it's not genre fiction, it's, I believe it is a YA title.
Probably. That's interesting, though. Whenever you try to write a character that's of a different background than you run that risk. Mm-hmm. You might have people saying, well, you were just doing that to cater to an audience. You might have people saying you did it wrong. You might have people saying you went over the top or stereotyped.
Yeah.
So that's probably a topic for another podcast. But
yeah, and there's examples, like I remember there was a recent Batgirl comic book where the writers brought in a TS transsexual character. And I don't want to spoil the whole thing for it, but after a while they said, no, this is a really bad thing. And other people saying, well, that was a character being bad. That it wasn't like, they weren't trying to stereotype everyone as being, again, I'm trying not to spoil this, but again, there was this author intent was to show a character go through changes, and not of the physical nature, but of other natures. But what was interpreted was something completely different. And I think we're working on a podcast for writing the other, the things that we don't think.
Oh, yeah.
So that's coming, folks.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, when you're releasing some work, and forgive me for getting on my soapbox here, but part of you loses control because it is an art, and so it is subjective, and it's going to be interpreted. Now, I'm not using this to let you use it as a protection against bad writing, or using really bad stereotypes in your writing. That's not why we talk about this. This is to let you know that no matter how well you write some things, other people have interpretations of it that may or may not agree with. And you kind of have to have that in the back of your mind. How am I going to deal with these type of things, if you even approach them at all? So I think oh, and by the way, I had to read fan fiction, some Buffy the Vampire fan fiction to deal with this, because it was using an example. So if you listen to our fan fiction episode, this was painful for me.
We should do an episode of you just reading fan fiction.
It'd be the most awful thing that ever happened to the internet.
That's setting the bar pretty high.
If you want to hear that, you may want to contribute to our currently non-existent Patreon or Kickstarter or whatever.
There you go. Have you ever set out to write something with a specific message to convey? I really don't think I have, because I hate the over-the-top preachiness. And I feel like if I have a message, it's going to be so obvious that I have a message that's just going to turn people off. So I look more for just writing the action.
I have. For me, it's when I do the shorter works. Mm-hmm. Because I need emotional response and being a little bit more upfront with how I'm writing it, trying to go to a certain point, as opposed to letting things play out themselves. I'm not saying I did it extremely well, but I have, on occasion, tried to make a point about the human condition,
Sure.
I guess.
I suppose that's what we're all writing about when it gets down to it.
Yes, when I write about dragons and lasers, I'm writing about... No, there's a whole other thing as what is the human condition, too. But anyway...
as far as interpretation, I'll admit there's been times where a song I think it's about something, then I'll hear the singer say, well, this song is about something, and I was way off, and then I almost feel like it does change the song a little bit. I'm thinking, well, so that's what they were actually singing about. That's not as fun as what I thought it was about.
Well, I'll Be Watching You by The Police.
That is such a stalker song.
And yet it's played
Every
at
Breath You Take,
Every Breath You Take, thank you. My apologies to Sting and all those others. But yeah, it's played at weddings.
Yeah.
Right? Or at least it was.
Now that's a curious one. What is the intent of the singers on that? I mean, that lyrics, and Adele. I swear all of her songs are stalker songs.
I'd have to plead ignorance on there. I have not listened to a lot of Adele, nor have I taken the time to analyze.
You don't drive as much as I do. You might.
I listen to podcasts while I drive because it's the only time I get a chance to listen to words without someone trying to talk over them.
Ouch.
Well, I think I've babbled on long enough about this topic. Forgive me for the soapboxy rant again. But yeah, it is something that you may come across and wonder, I didn't mean for this thing to be interpreted that way, but it will be, because everyone has their own lens and how they take things in and make things click. And there are parts of your work that you throw in there that you don't even remember, and someone will come back to you and say, you remember that part where so-and-so did that thing with that, rutabaga. And you'll go, rutabaga? It happens because people will pick up on certain things.
Yeah. We're a little over, but I wanted to bring up one more thing that we didn't touch on. I think there is a problem when you write something with complete innocence and someone else reads something into that. You might say, look at the writer's sexism show through by the way he wrote this character.
Yeah.
How do you prepare for that?
Oh, man. I mean, the best you could do is be honest with that.
Yeah.
And there are going to be people who say, well, you didn't intentionally do it, but it was your subconscious going through. At which point, you're just like, if it's subconscious, I can't,
Yeah.
I can't do that. And one thing to remember is, if you're following what we've been suggesting, is when you're doing, especially novels, you have them edited. You have another set of eyes, and hopefully they will catch maybe some of these unintentional things. Beta readers, hopefully they will catch some of these things. So those are another good reasons for you to have other people look at your work before it goes to a larger audience.
Very true.
But again, I'm of the belief that there are some people who say the reader's intent or reader's interpretation is the only thing that matters, and I'd say wrong. But then again, that's my opinion. I encourage people to go through, think this over, read some other people's opinions, and come up with their own belief. But yeah, I think the best you can do is be honest in your reactions to people who say, or I'm completely offended by this, and ask them why. What was it? So that way I can learn, or point out the things that were offensive. And if it was something, then you can say, I've learned as a person, I've grown from it. And if it's completely wrong, then you can say, that it was not written that way. But you have to be honest and be open to that type of thing.
Sure.
Or you could be like other authors and say, harumph, close your door and stomp back up the mountain.
That's always the best way to do it.
I think so.
That's the best way to end the podcast, too.
Harumph!
Thanks for listening. Interpret this podcast as you will, and judge us by our intent. Don't judge us by our intent.
It's up to you to decide.
But
and get off our internet lawn.
Yeah. Regardless, do visit us on the web at www.writegoodbooks.com/podcast. And thanks for listening.
See ya.
Bye.